I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche and Marx for the 21st Century by Jonas, Čeika, CCK,
It's pronounced Jonas Čeika.
Oh, hey, it's Jonas Čeika, author of How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche and Marx for the 21st Century. How you doing, man?
Hey, Radical Reviewer. I'm doing well. I've just been, crying about the death of Rosa Luxemburg again. But anyway, you're doing a review of my book, right?
Yeah, I thought I'd check it out. The title alone caught my attention. Oh, hey, Jonas, while I have you here, would you like to help and read the quotes I used from your book?
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll hear from you in a bit. In the meantime, where was I? Oh, right. This book is brought to us by Repeater Books Publishing, and it came out in 2021. The key idea of this text is to take a truer, deeper look at our two main boys here, the Deuterinos on the cover of the text, Nietzsche and Marx, to get beyond the distortions and pacifications of their ideas that passes for the mainstream understanding of Marxism and Nietzscheanism. This is achieved by using Nietzschean thought to uncover the denounced or ignored or overlooked aspects of Marxism, and vice versa. As Čeika explains it,
using each thinker to bring out what is already present in the other.
Getting a little more detailed, Čeika says that this book can be reduced to 5 main components: Nietzsche, Marx, philosophy, modernity, and human emancipation, stating,
what hopefully emerges throughout is a particular way of doing philosophy, a particular way of understanding modernity, a particular way of reading Marx and Nietzsche, and finally, a particular route towards human emancipation.
So, knowing what we're about to find out in the pages ahead, let's take a look at this text in depth, starting with Chapter 1, Philosophizing with a Hammer. So what the heck does it mean to philosophize with a hammer? Well, how I see it, it's kind of like the concept hammer here is to philosophy what praxis is to theory. Like the active element, the concept put into action. Before we get to that though, Čeika wants us to look at the philosophical body which wields this philosophical hammer. He argues that classic philosophers often separated our thoughts from our physical existence. They saw the body as a prison, the body and soul as distinct, separate entities. Something you might remember when we discussed this in Debt the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. Using the logic of the market, these philosophies saw people in very individualistic terms. Social attachments were seen as bondage, the body was a prison for the soul, things like that. But Čeika doesn't want to separate the body from the soul, the body from the natural world. He wants our philosophical understanding to be very much grounded in the world. This is how he wants to philosophize with the body that wields the philosophical hammer. He states,
to philosophize with the body means, first of all, to recognize the essential significance of the body for both theory and practice, which both precedes philosophy and guides it.
Nietzsche's philosophy, for example, is very grounded in the natural world, embodied in, the body. Perhaps because he spent most of his life suffering from a cavalcade of physical ailments, migraines, viral infections, dysentery, seizures, strokes, and so on. Čeika argues that this grounded philosophical understanding is rooted in change. He states,
for the Nietzschean and the Marxist, it is with Heraclitus that philosophy truly begins. He was Nietzsche's favorite ancient Greek thinker, and Marx considered him the greatest ancient after Aristotle. Why? Because Heraclitus made process, becoming, flux the central principle of his philosophy.
Now, if you're thinking, awesome, Radical Reviewer, thank you. Yes, I know all about the different philosophical schools of antiquity, and I know Heraclitus' work very well, and I understand this quote. Thank you very much.
Let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates?
Yes.
Morons.
If that's the case, then okay, good for you. But for everyone else, Heraclitus was an ancient Greek philosopher who talked all about how you can't step in the same stream twice because the stream is always changing, you're always changing, everything is always changing. You probably heard of this guy in some history or philosophy class like in high school or something. I certainly remembered exactly who he was, and had nothing to do with the fact that Čeika describes who Heraclitus was in this chapter of the book. Anyways, the basics of this process becoming flux idea is that
The body is by nature constantly changing, and our philosophy must reflect this change.
so okay, the body that wields this philosophical hammer must be grounded in reality, and grounded in our ever-changing nature. Čeika then takes a look at this hammer that our philosophical body is wielding. He describes this hammer in a number of symbolic levels, stating,
At the first level, the hammer is the earliest human tool for which definitive evidence exists. At the second level of inscription, the hammer exists as a socio-political symbol. Throughout history, it has symbolized blacksmith guilds, families, political entities, professions. In mythology, it was wielded by gods. In folklore, it symbolized strength. Finally, it gained a new significance as a symbol of working-class power with the rise of industrial labor.
and the third level, the poetic level,
It represents both a destructive force, as it smashes and breaks into pieces, and a constructive force, as it builds and manufactures.
putting this philosophical hammer to use, Čeika argues that
The ultimate goal of a reader of both Marx and Nietzsche is to overcome them, render them obsolete by overcoming modernity. This entails refusing to reduce them to a scholarly exercise and instead realizing them in praxis.
haha, see? The hammer is just like the philosophical version of praxis. See, didn't I tell you? Anyway, Čeika continues.
Nietzsche's philosophy is nothing if not a means to invigorate life, and Marx's is nothing if not an attempt to render theory into a material force.
Okay, cool. So let's use our philosophical body, grounded in our ever-fluctuating nature, to wield this philosophical hammer to destroy and rebuild our philosophical understanding, to overcome modernity. Wait, modernity? Well, what the heck is modernity? Čeika describes 3 elements which make up modernity. He states,
First of all, modernity is characterized by the fact that humanity's own creations assume a power beyond our control, independent of any particular individual or group of individuals, and comes to confront us as an external power, dominating over us. Capital for Marx and the ascetic ideal for Nietzsche.
basically, both capitalist institutions, Google, Walmart, Raytheon, or whatever, and non-capitalist institutions such as the church or the prison industrial complex or whatever, exert power which is beyond the control of even those at the head of those institutions. Listen, I don't want to destroy the environment, I'm just doing my job. If it wasn't for me, someone else would do it. The truth is, I don't have a choice. I just have to do what provides the greatest possible profits for my shareholders. It's out of my control!
Secondly, modernity is characterized by the reversal between means and ends.
For example, workers spending their days doing things they find no value in. Capitalism telling people to get on that Sigma grind set, while traditionalism and religion tell people that self-flagellation and denial is Christ-like, or whatever. Yo, what's up? Radical Reviewer here, telling you that if you want to be a top G like me, get on that Sigma male Chad hustler grind set. If you want to drive a Bugatti like me, you better be driving Uber for a few hours every day before work and still be 5 minutes early for your shift. Hustle, hustle, hustle! If you want to show up in the club in a Bugatti on the weekends like me, you better be spending your weekends driving that Honda Civic for Uber, boy! And
Finally, owing to the first 2 elements, modernity assumes the character of something shadowy and ephemeral. The forces which dominate us, despite their immense power, are never concrete, visible, tangible. We live under the shadow of their abstract domination.
basically,
What even goes on in these big buildings? I've been looking at them all my life, but I've never been inside one. Are these the towers where the ruling lizards gather? Drinking human blood? Licking whipped cream off the interns?
these forces of modernity encapsulate everything in society, even Marx and Nietzsche themselves. Čeika states,
It is important to recognize that these tendencies, Marx's economic one and Nietzsche's cultural one, are truly part of a single total process, the process of modernization. Capitalism and nihilism both produce the conditions of their own overcoming. Modernity can only transition into its own self-perpetuation so long. Eventually, it must transition into its own destruction.
Chapter 2, A Nietzschean Socialism. Now, Nietzsche has made great critiques of capitalism and religion, for example stating,
The worker usually sees in the employer only a cunning, blood-sucking dog of a man.
Hey, I resemble that remark. Anyway.
A dog of a man who speculates on all distress and whose name, figure, manner, and reputation are completely indifferent to him.
However, Nietzsche's critiques of socialism are quite flawed, but we might find a Nietzschean socialism hidden there. And so, Čeika looks at Nietzsche's critiques of socialism and compares them to what Marx actually argued for, and thus figures out what a Nietzschean socialism might look like. For example, Nietzsche saw socialism as a secular version of religious asceticism. You know, like living like Jesus or a monk, the humble life of sacrifice and submission, disguised greed and envy, lack of individualism. But Čeika retorts,
every single reason for which Marx attacks crude communism here, its asceticism, social leveling, disguised envy and greed, loss of personality and of culture, corresponds exactly to the reasons for which Nietzsche attacked socialism.
Equality of outcome in a literal sense would have to mean everyone becoming the same person, and anyone who thinks that Marxism is about enforcing equality of outcome has not even begun to understand it. Notice that even the famous phrase "from each according to ability to each according to need" that Marx used to describe the higher phase of communism implies neither equality of opportunity nor equality of outcome.
In fact, it isn't socialism which is plagued with asceticism, but capitalism.
We are Walmart. Everybody, one more time. We are Walmart.
The Sigma male grind set, side hustles, wearing a uniform, signing an employer's non-disparagement agreement limiting what you can say about your job and your private life. You better be driving Uber for a few hours every day before work and still be 5 minutes early for your shift. Hustle, hustle, hustle! Socialism, on the other paw, isn't about sacrifice and submission. As we've talked about several times before, it's about giving people more freedom, more control over their lives and the society around them. Moving on, both Nietzsche and Marx were deeply opposed to the state. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra says,
"The state is the coldest of all cold monsters, and coldly it tells lies, and this lie drones on from its mouth. I, the state, am the people."
And maybe you remember this quote from Critique of the Gotha Program review. As far as the present cooperative societies are concerned, they are of value only insofar as they are the independent creations of the workers, and not protégés either of the government or of the bourgeoisie. Nietzsche describes rights as a push and pull between a dominant and subservient group, something a dominant group gives to a subservient group. For example, the state gives us the right to vote in exchange for us not rioting in the streets, which sounds like something very similar to Marx discussing the capitalist division of labor and alienation. Čeika puts it this way.
Rights, in other words, are essentially recognized and guaranteed degrees of power. The granting of rights necessarily presupposes that our power is alienated from us, and the entire framework of rights would therefore be superseded in a classless society.
Lastly, in thinking about a Nietzschean socialism, Čeika looks at what is the most common comparison made between Nietzsche and Marx, that Nietzsche was an individualist and Marx a collectivist. Čeika considers this distinction both wrong and boring. Like, what does this distinction even really mean? Capitalism, for example, paradoxically imposes both. We are atomized and individualized through each having our own separate cars and separate cubicles at work, having our own toolboxes at home, the elimination of common areas, and things like that. But also, our individualism is destroyed because our workplaces dictate how the workplace is run, what clothing is to be worn, when we can go on breaks, and things like that. And of course, socialism, and by extension a Nietzschean socialism, promotes the exact opposite. As Čeika concludes,
only when virtues can no longer be bought or rented, when they can no longer be commodified, marketed, or advertised, only then can one's virtues reflect what one is.
Chapter 3, Morality and Aufhebung. Chapter 3, Morality and Aufhebung. Čeika starts by explaining that Nietzsche and Marx both critiqued the Western ethical concept of morality, specifically a morality.
First, that it is universal, equally applicable to all. Secondly, that its obligations are unconditional. Third, that it is ahistorical, valid for all times and places. Fourth, that we have moral responsibility to follow it and should feel guilt or remorse if we don't. And fifth, that in accordance to it, our actions can be judged as good or evil in absolute terms.
One of Nietzsche's critiques comes from a determinist angle, that we can't judge the morality of an action because that action had a cause, and that cause in turn had a cause, and that cause in turn had a cause, and so on and so on.
And so on and so on.
Into infinity. So our actions are not free, despite moral responsibility presupposing free will. Another critique is how morality functions within power structures. For example,
Nietzsche's category of slaves refers to the people who are deprived in various ways, and lack any means of dealing with this deprivation materially. If they lack access to food, they thus proclaim that gluttony is a sin. Because they are incapable of taking revenge against their enemies, they proclaim wrath and vengeance to be a sin. Because they lack wealth, they proclaim greed to be a sin. If they are unable to get laid, they proclaim lust to be a sin. In this way, they attempt to thrive in their own impotence by proclaiming that the very things they lack are in fact not desirable at all, and thus turn their weakness into virtue.
In this way, morality is determined by the master and is used to pacify the slave through domination of oneself, through self-control. Father, I am sad. My children are hungry. My wife is sick. My workers in my union, they want to strike for better wages, which will drastically improve my life, but I don't know what to do. A strike, my dear boy. You're falling for the sin of greed and vengeance. You're right, Father. I'm being envious of the blessings our God has bestowed upon my employer. That's right, the meek shall inherit the earth. The Lord is merely testing my virtue. I must live like Job, and if I do, I will eat pie in the sky when I die. Very good, boy, very good. This is the asceticism that Nietzsche was so against. It is
a morality that addresses people's problems only by aggravating them, that teaches people to blame themselves, that encourages them to want less and seek less, to renounce and resign.
Some might argue that socialism, that leftism, has a sense of morality too. It judges the millionaires, the exploiters, the polluters as morally wrong for the harms they cause. To this, Čeika argues,
radicalism is in fact diametrically opposed to moralism. Moralism means identifying individual guilt and dispersing punishment. Radicalism means grasping at the root of the issue, and the root of the issue is never individual guilt, but social relations.
Now, we've talked about this before, but this is basically why radical right-wing folks go around and shoot up mosques and kill the people that they blame for the problems in society. Whereas radical left-wing folks don't kill people. Instead, they focus on the destruction of material conditions, destroying capitalist and state property. This is the revolutionary radicalism we need. Čeika adds,
there is no limit to the cruelty that the ruling class will resort to in order to protect its interests. It is precisely because the ruling classes know they cannot let their actions speak for themselves that they must deny the innocence of becoming. If overcoming guilt is possible, this overcoming can only be carried out by a revolutionary class, one that speaks for itself. This entails self-determination.
Having destroyed morality through Nietzschean and Marxist philosophy, we now move to the Aufhebung of the chapter's title. Čeika explains that
the concept refers to a dialectical motion which simultaneously cancels, preserves, and lifts up, in which the abolition of one element replaces that element with something new, while nevertheless preserving within itself the preceding dialectical process.
In this way, dialectics and the move from primitive communism to class society to communism is a kind of Aufhebung. The Übermensch, as an evolution from instinct to consciousness to Übermensch, is a kind of Aufhebung. Čeika explains that
all of this leads to the final crucial aspect of Marx's and Nietzsche's central Aufhebung. Given the fact that the possibility of overcoming is found within, latent in the internal constitution of things, the Aufhebung must involve the abolition of the very agent carrying it out.
This is the revolutionary working class destroying both the capitalist class and the working class as class distinctions. This is the Übermensch destroying both master morality and slave morality. Chapter 4, Historical Philosophy, Philosophical History. Čeika starts by explaining that Nietzsche had critiqued both an overfocus on history and a lack of historical understanding. That you could be overfocused on history, basically living in the past, with no room for anything new. Or you could lack historical knowledge and so lack a past, a future, lack meaning itself. Basically, don't be some kind of paleo-conservative reactionary with your head stuck in the sands of time, but also don't be all rudderless with no knowledge or appreciation of history. As Čeika explains it,
Nietzsche's approach to history was genealogical. Necessities in history do exist, but only within particular historical periods. Given the right set of preconditions, certain social formations may manifest themselves according to a necessary logic. But this is never a logic applicable to history as a whole, and it is often followed by historical ruptures, breaches, and leaps. Complex social phenomena are rarely the result of a continuous progressive development, traceable to a single starting point. They are more often a matter of multiple, originally independent, contingent social elements coming together.
So Nietzsche was against grand historical narratives that could be applied to history as a whole. Kinda sounds like Nietzsche was somewhat of a postmodernist, and if this book is a Nietzschean guide to Marxism, does that mean that this book is nothing but a bunch of
postmodern neo-Marxists? Postmodern neo-Marxists. Postmodern neo-Marxists. Postmodern neo-Marxists. Well, that's postmodern neo-Marxism for you, you know.
An example Čeika uses is that although the Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche is antithetical to Nietzsche, it is nonetheless an inescapable genealogical layer of the school of thought that is Nietzscheanism. We just have to also remember that the same goes for Nietzschean Marxists, of whom Čeika discusses some of the more prominent thinkers, whose names I will now butcher. Alexander Bogdanov, Stanislav Volsky, Anatoly Lukyanchakri, and Vladimir Bazarov. Yep, perfect. Nailed it. Discussing the Nietzsche-Nazi connection, Čeika explains that Nietzsche actually hated militarism, war, and anti-Semitism, but that his sister, who gained control of his archives after his death, distorted how his works were interpreted, and even went so far as to fabricate letters to make Nietzsche seem more like a nationalist. On the Soviet side of things, the Soviet Union banned Nietzsche's works in 1923, based on the fascist interpretation of his work. And so Čeika concludes,
it was a win-win situation for both regimes. Nazi Germany completely neutralized Nietzsche's radical and transformative potential, and the Soviet Union, which itself had become entirely life-denying, was able to denounce Nietzsche as a philosopher of fascism.
Chapter 5, Affirming Life. This chapter starts by explaining that both Marx and Nietzsche believed that the goal of life was to be well-rounded, well-educated, critically thinking, curious, in other words, to live an affirming life. So, let's just do that. Like, what's even stopping us? Or well, I guess there is the capitalist division of labor. Čeika puts it this way.
The capitalist division of labor removes all empowering and life-affirming elements from the process of satisfying one's needs. When a society reduces the mass of the population to tools, a direct outcome of this is that they must be reduced to a small number of functions, which never change or admit of unpredictability and spontaneity, such that workers would be reliable to their employers.
Hustle, hustle, hustle! Okay, so the capitalist division of labor is bad and dumb. What should we do instead? Well, agreeing with other leftist authors that we've discussed before, such as Peter Kropotkin or Michael Albert, Čeika states,
society could be organized such that the rotation of tasks makes possible varied forms of activity, where an individual can work in construction one day and design or architecture another.
This might sound pie in the sky. Like, how will we have people learn all these different jobs? Specialization is difficult, it's a waste of time and resources, yada yada yada. But I would argue that this is effective on two grounds. One, many rote tasks are easy to learn. We aren't talking about someone doing brain surgery one day and repairing truck engines the next, but rather folks working various aspects of one workplace. Brain surgery one day and cleaning bedpans the next, rebuilding a truck engine one day and then cleaning and organizing tools next. And two, This is about buy-in. We talked about this in the last video, but to reiterate the idea here, let's say that we have a democratic worker-controlled workplace, but we keep the same capitalist division of labor we currently have. Obviously, the folks who do work in positions of ordering new products, answering emails, scheduling shifts, or whatever, are going to have a lot more say during the democratic workplace meetings than someone who sweeps floors all day. But if tasks are shared, if jobs are rotated, folks performing various tasks that suit them best, the capitalist division of labor will be destroyed, and worker freedom, workplace democracy will prevail. Bringing this back to philosophy, Čeika attacks the way the division of labor between manual labor and mental labor reflects the way that Western philosophy tends to separate the body and the soul, the body and the mind. Čeika argues that unlike most other philosophers,
Nietzsche elevated sense experience against all that had previously been used to undermine it, and so he elevated the aesthetic too. To him, the aesthetic became not only central to, but even essential to life.
Čeika elaborates.
Society, Nietzsche says, views its subjects only as tools, instruments, and the mark of a good instrument is its lack of change, its predictability, its dedication to a single set of functions. But true freedom is freedom to become, to surpass oneself, to unleash powers one wasn't even aware of, to affirm life.
We're often told that being productive is about doing things that make money, being on that Sigma grind set. The common small talk question of, what do you do, refers to what one does for money. However, making money is often not the primary goal of productivity. Čeika follows this by naming
4 characteristics that Marx once listed in his notes as characterizing productive activity under socialism. First, the individual sees their personality in it. Second, seeing others use it and enjoy it. Third, seeing others enjoy one's creation, one feels their own value and self-worth affirmed by others. And fourth, in seeing my individuality reflected in the people enjoying my product.
Seeing my individuality reflected in people enjoying my product? I think this quote might be from one of Marx's erotic fan fictions he was writing. But anyway, we've essentially seen these 4 characteristics before in previous books we've covered on the channel, such as Anarchy Works, Mutual Aid, or ABC of Anarchism. We've also seen it in YouTube videos such as The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And you have even seen this countless times in your own lives, with folks spending countless hours and time and energy learning to play an instrument, or paint, or sew, or crochet, donating time to their local churches or food banks or other charitable pursuits, setting up local sports teams or D&D campaigns or card game tournaments, designing websites or apps or video games, all with no expectation of profiting off of their endeavors, but instead doing these things for the 4 reasons that Marx named: expressing their personality, seeing joy in others, feeling affirmed by this creativity, and seeing their individuality reflected in that productivity. But how do we create such a world with this socialist-style productivity being the norm? Reflecting on the radical movements in the 19th and 20th century, it can seem pretty hopeless. The radical labor movement, the era of radical anarchists like Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, it seemed like they had so much power than we do, and yet their movement failed. Are we just doomed? To this, Čeika states,
The eternal recurrence steps in at this point and manifests itself as a question.
Wait, new concept here. The eternal recurrence? So it's my understanding that the eternal recurrence originated in some ancient religions as this idea that everything repeats itself. Nietzsche uses this concept to ask if we would look at this knowledge that everything repeats itself and reflect on our lives and be in despair or rejoice. Okay, so let's look back at what Čeika has to say.
The eternal recurrence steps in at this point and manifests itself as a question. If life, in all of its details, every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small or great must return to you, what kind of life would you prefer to return to? Would you prefer to spend your present in resignation, so that each time it returns you would have to live in wretched complacency once again, made worse by how unsatisfactory it is, with the thought that you could have changed things for the better gnawing at you? Or would you prefer to live out your present in a tragic battle, struggle no matter how dim the light of hope is, and know that even if you failed in the end, you are certain that you did all you could?
And Čeika concludes that Nietzsche's last man was supposed to be a man under socialism, but in reality he's in fact a man under capitalism, one who has no goals or no passions, he simply seeks pleasure. Čeika states,
The last man seeks only simple pleasures and security, but the rioters are no longer satisfied with simple pleasures, and security is useless when there is nothing left worth securing. The last man moralizes and calculates. He deems revolution to be too risky, and its transgressions to be immoral. But the rioters want to risk, and they want to transgress. Their will to power demands it.
And finally, a preface to the ending. Čeika begins the ending by arguing that
if there is an essential link between philosophy and social relations, then it is possible to cut out the middleman called language and address philosophical problems by addressing social relations.
For example, the philosophical distinction between subject and object, which we've talked about throughout this text, the separation of manual labor and mental labor, separation of soul and body, of subject and object, Čeika solves this problem in this way.
The reason modern philosophy finds the subject-object relation problematic is because the subject, that is the real living producing human being, is estranged, alienated from its object, nature and its resources, which humans utilize in production. This alienation is caused by definite social relations, and is therefore a social, political issue. By fashioning nature according to their needs, interests, and desires, the subjects would realize themselves in the object, and thereby achieve unity between subject and object.
Basically, changes in social relations can change and solve philosophical problems which aren't solved through idealism alone. Čeika ultimately ends the text arguing that
socialism and life affirmation are not fantasies or ideals that we dream up or pluck from the sky to then impose onto the world. Rather, they are real imminent historical possibilities, made possible and even necessary by already existing conditions.
Oh no, wait. There is a post-ending credit scene, if you will. Čeika states,
this work of philosophy does not end on the book's final pages. If it ends at all, it will end beyond all books, where the philosophical problems brought up here are tackled at their source, the social relations that produce and maintain them.
Damn, I like that. Good stuff. I could literally end every video with this statement. Conclusion. You know, whether it's the common sort of pop philosophy understanding of these two thinkers, or even what's picked up in a Philosophy 101 class, we often think of Nietzscheanism and Marxism as very different schools of thought. But it turns out that Nietzsche's existentialist goals and Marx's materialist goals are often trying to drastically change the world in very similar ways to solve very similar problems. For us on this channel, this more individualistic, more anarchistic version of Marx is nothing new. We saw this in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, and we especially saw it in the Critique of the Gotha program. However, on this channel, we have not covered Nietzsche at all. So it's fascinating to find similar critiques of society, of modernity, in Nietzsche. Although this text is a bit of a guide to Marx for fans of Nietzsche, I actually haven't read anything by Nietzsche outside of a few passages from Thus Spoke Zarathustra in a Philosophy 101 class back in 2007, so I more took this text as a guide to Nietzsche as a fan of Marx. Either way, if you're familiar with Marx and unfamiliar with Nietzsche, as I am, or perhaps familiar with Nietzsche but not Marx, or hell, maybe you're a big brain genius who's familiar with both thinkers, either way, there's a lot of interesting concepts to grapple with here in this exploration of Nietzsche and Marx. So if that sounds appealing to you, I recommend How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle, Nietzsche and Marx for the 21st Century by Jonas Čeika. Speaking of Jonas, thank you so much, Jonas, for sticking with us and helping out today covering your book.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for taking the time to read and review it. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you liked it.
And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. Your tremendous support has allowed me to get dog insurance, which is wonderful. You've allowed me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. Gotta love that. You helped me to overcome a bit of the asceticism and alienation that comes with the capitalist mode of production by giving me a little more time to focus on my creative pursuits. I love that. And you provided me with a little extra funds for books and dog toys and things like that, which is really awesome. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
all of you went to school when you were in grade school, right? And you went to high school and maybe you didn't like it, but maybe your mother said to you, you know, yeah, maybe you should go to college. Because, like, really, to get a good job, you have to give a good education. It was on all those public service announcements. Finally got out of college and said, well, you have to have a good job. You're lucky. You've been to college. You can get a job in an office. You're sitting in the office saying, well, what the fuck do I do here? And they said, well, I don't know. There's a typewriter there. Why don't you try typing? I type a little bit. Like, well, what do I have to do now? I don't know. Answer some phone calls. Okay, okay, a couple of years pass. You start drinking heavily. You're like drinking heavily. You're coming later and later and later and later and later and later to work. And finally you like stop coming entirely. They start calling you, what's wrong? You're doing well. You got a pension plan. You got profit sharing. What's going on? And like finally one day you walk in the office, you take your pants and say, here it is. Here's my fucking dick. Do what you want with it, but I don't want to work here anymore.